What side are you? This is Harlan County, Kentucky. Deep in this vast wilderness lies the story of Silas Combs, a man who vanished in
The Kentucky Vanishing of 1963. The man who killed 21 deputies and vanished for 40 years into the mountains. In the autumn of 1963, while America mourned a president and the world trembled at the edge of nuclear annihilation, something happened in the mountains of eastern Kentucky that would become known simply as the Vanishing. 21 sheriff's deputies disappeared over the course of 6 weeks, their bodies never recovered, their fates unknown until a hermit emerged from the wilderness 40 years later with journals that explained everything. The man responsible had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, watching from ridges that overlooked the very communities that had spent decades searching for him. His name was Ezekiel Combs, and this is the true story of the most complete disappearance in American criminal history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Breathitt County, Kentucky, in the heart of the Eastern Highlands, during the turbulent years of the early 1960s, when the war on poverty was being declared, but had not yet arrived in hollows where poverty had been the only constant for generations. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the Revolutionary War, who considered themselves citizens of the mountains before they were citizens of any nation that claimed dominion over them. You see, in Breathitt County during the years of our story, a place so violent it had earned the nickname Bloody Breathitt in the previous century, the tension between federal programs and local autonomy had reached a breaking point. The government was arriving with initiatives that promised to transform the region, but that transformation required cooperation from families who had survived by refusing to cooperate with any authority beyond their own traditions. The clash between old ways and new intentions would produce consequences that no one anticipated. The man at the center of our story was born Ezekiel Combs in 1920, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where his family had lived since 1798. He had survived the Depression as a child, had fought across Europe during the Second World War, had returned to the mountains that had always been his home with skills and experiences that he hoped to never use again. He was 43 years old in the autumn of 1963, a man whose quiet exterior concealed capabilities that few people suspected and that circumstances would soon reveal. That's right. Ezekiel Combs was not the kind of man that strangers underestimated twice. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, had dark hair that was beginning to show grey at the temples, possessed eyes that were the pale blue of winter sky, and that seemed to see things that others missed. His body remained powerful despite the years that had passed since the war, maintained by labor that mountain farming required and by habits that military service had instilled. He had been a sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division, had parachuted into Normandy on D-Day, and had fought through the hedgerows and across the Rhine into Germany itself. The war had taught him things about survival and about killing that he had compartmentalized upon his return, had stored in mental spaces that peacetime did not require him to access. But the skills remained available, waiting for circumstances that would justify their use. His family consisted of his wife Sarah, who was 40 years old, and whose beauty had not diminished despite 2 decades of mountain labor, and their son Thomas, who was 17 years old, and who possessed his father's quiet strength and his mother's gentle nature. The family worked a small farm that had been in Combs' hands for over a century and a half, lived a life that asked nothing from the outside world except to be left alone. The trouble that would transform Ezekiel from mountain farmer to mass murderer began with the arrival of a new sheriff named Vernon Crawford, a man whose appointment had been engineered by interests that intended to exploit the federal programs flooding into the region. Crawford had been brought in from outside the county, had no connections to the families whose lives he would now control, owed his position entirely to patrons whose goals required a sheriff willing to do whatever they demanded. Crawford's mandate was simple: identify families whose property could be seized under various federal programs, process that seizure through legal mechanisms that the families could not contest, and ensure that resistance was eliminated before it could organize. The process was dressed in the language of progress and poverty elimination, but its purpose was enrichment of those who had arranged Crawford's appointment. The Combs property had been identified as a target because of its location. The hollow where the family lived contained timber that logging interests coveted and mineral rights that coal companies intended to exploit. The family's resistance to previous offers had been noted, and Crawford's patrons had determined that legal mechanisms would accomplish what negotiation had not. The first indication of what was coming arrived in September of 1963, when Crawford appeared at the Combs property with documents claiming that the family owed taxes that they had actually paid, asserting liens that had no legal basis, threatening seizure if the fabricated debts were not immediately satisfied. The documents were fraudulent, but the courts that would adjudicate any challenge were controlled by the same interests that had created them. Ezekiel recognized the scheme immediately, had seen similar tactics employed against other families, had watched neighbors lose property that had been in their families for generations to legal processes that were legitimate in form but corrupt in substance. He had hoped that his family's relative isolation would protect them, but that hope had proven unfounded. "These documents are false," Ezekiel told Crawford during their first confrontation. "We have paid every tax that was legitimately owed. We owe nothing to anyone, and we will not surrender property that has been in our family since George Washington was president because you have manufactured claims that honest courts would reject." Crawford's response was a smile that conveyed confidence that honest courts would never have the opportunity to review what he was doing. "The law is the law, Mr. Combs. You can contest these claims through proper channels if you believe they're unjust. But until those contests are resolved, the property remains subject to seizure. I suggest you cooperate." Resistance tends to make these situations worse for everyone involved. The weeks that followed were consumed by attempts to find legal remedies that did not exist. Lawyers Ezekiel consulted declined to challenge Crawford's claims, either because they knew the courts would not support such challenges or because they feared consequences that challenging Crawford would produce. Officials who might have intervened refused to become involved. The machinery that Crawford represented was too powerful for any individual family to resist through legitimate means. The situation escalated on October 15, 1963, when Crawford arrived at the Combs property with 21 deputies to execute a seizure order that no legitimate court had issued. They came with trucks to haul away livestock, with equipment to begin logging operations, with the confidence of men who believed their authority was absolute and their actions beyond consequence. What happened that morning would be disputed for decades, would be reconstructed only when Ezekiel's journals were finally discovered 40 years later. The official story, the story that Crawford had prepared and that the county's records would reflect, was that the Combs family had resisted lawful seizure with violence, that deputies had been forced to respond with force that circumstances required, that the deaths that occurred were unfortunate but justified. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Crawford had not come merely to seize property. He had come to eliminate a family whose resistance had become an example that other families might follow, whose continued existence threatened the scheme that he and his patrons had constructed. The seizure was a pretext for violence that had been planned before the deputies ever left town. The morning of October 15, 1963, began like any other morning the Combs family had experienced throughout their years together. Sarah had risen early to prepare breakfast, had sent Thomas out to tend the livestock that the family kept, had begun her own work in the garden that provided vegetables through the growing season. Ezekiel had been repairing a fence in the back pasture, work that kept him out of sight of the road where Crawford's convoy would approach. Sarah was in the garden when they arrived, was visible from the road in ways that made her the first target of the operation Crawford had planned. She was kneeling among the tomato plants, her back to the road, her attention focused on work that had occupied her throughout every growing season since she and Ezekiel had married. She was wearing a blue dress that Ezekiel had bought her for their anniversary, was humming a hymn that she had learned from her mother, was living the final moments of her life without any awareness that those moments were final. The deputies did not announce themselves, did not demand compliance, did not follow any procedure that legitimate law enforcement would require. They simply deployed from their vehicles with weapons drawn, took positions that suggested they had rehearsed this operation, and opened fire on a woman whose only crime was working in a garden that her family had cultivated for generations. The first bullet struck Sarah in the back, between her shoulder blades, passed through her body, and emerged from her chest in a spray of blood that darkened the tomato plants she had been tending. She fell forward into the garden, her body crushing plants that she had nurtured from seedlings, her hands reaching toward soil that would receive her blood before she could understand what was happening. The second and third bullets struck her as she fell, wounds that were immediately fatal, damage that no medical intervention could have repaired, even if medical intervention had been available. She was dead before her body came to rest, was dead before the sound of the shots had finished echoing off the ridges that surrounded the property, was dead before Ezekiel understood what the sounds he was hearing meant. Thomas heard the shots from the barn, where he was feeding chickens, heard sounds that his mind required seconds to identify as gunfire. He ran toward the garden without thinking, a 17-year-old whose instincts drove him toward the mother he had seen working there minutes before. He did not consider the danger, did not calculate the odds, simply ran toward Sarah with the desperate energy of a child who cannot accept that his mother might be hurt. "Mama!" he screamed as he ran, his voice carrying across the property with a clarity that made his location obvious to every deputy present. "Mama!" The deputies shot him as he ran, cut him down with multiple rounds that struck his body before he could reach Sarah's fallen form. He fell approximately 20 feet from where his mother lay, his body twisted by impacts that had changed his trajectory, his eyes still fixed on the garden where he could see her dress among the plants. He was not dead immediately. The wounds were fatal, but death took nearly a minute to arrive. A minute during which Thomas tried to crawl toward his mother, despite damage that made such movement impossible. His hands clawed at dirt that offered no purchase, his legs refused commands that his dying mind still issued, his eyes remained fixed on a mother he would never reach. "Mama," he whispered, the word barely audible, blood bubbling from his lips as he spoke. "Mama, I'm coming." He died with his hand outstretched toward Sarah, died reaching for a mother who could not reach back, died in dirt that his family had worked for generations and that now received his blood as it had received his mother's. Ezekiel heard the shots from the back pasture, heard sounds that his military training identified immediately as rifle fire. He ran toward the house, toward the shots, toward a disaster that his speed could not prevent. He crested the ridge that separated the pasture from the garden, in time to see Thomas fall, in time to watch his son die while reaching for a wife whose body already lay still among the tomatoes. He saw everything in the space of 30 seconds. The deputies in positions around the property, Sarah's body in the garden, Thomas's body on the ground, the weapons that were now turning toward him as the deputies identified a new target. Something changed inside him in those 30 seconds, something that had been dormant since the war ended, something that would not rest until every man responsible had experienced consequences that exceeded anything the legal system could have provided. He did not charge the deputies in grief-stricken rage. He did not attempt resistance that their numbers would have overwhelmed. He simply retreated into the cabin, into the root cellar beneath it, into passages that led to exits the deputies did not know existed. He disappeared while the deputies were still firing at a cabin they believed contained a man they intended to kill. Crawford ordered the cabin burned when no response emerged from within, assumed that Ezekiel had died in the flames that consumed the structure his family had occupied for generations. The official report would record 3 deaths, Samuel, Sarah, and Thomas Combs, would attribute those deaths to resistance against lawful authority, would close the matter as concluded. But Ezekiel had not died. He had emerged from the passages that his grandfather had constructed decades before, had watched from concealment as his home burned, and as the deputies congratulated each other on a successful operation. He had memorized faces, had counted men, had begun planning vengeance that would be complete regardless of how long completion required. The transformation that followed was absolute. The man who emerged from the burning of his homestead was not the farmer who had tended crops and raised a son and loved a wife for 20 years. He was the sergeant who had killed across Europe, whose skills in that regard had never diminished despite decades of disuse. He was something that Crawford's deputies could not have imagined and that they would not survive encountering. Ezekiel spent 2 weeks preparing, gathering supplies from caches he had maintained since his return from the war. establishing positions throughout the county where he could observe and strike and withdraw without detection. He studied the deputies who had participated in the murders, learned their routines and their vulnerabilities, identified the sequences in which they would be taken. The first disappearance occurred on November 1st, 1963. A deputy named Dale Tackett simply vanished while patrolling a road that wound through hollows where no one would report what happened to law enforcement. His vehicle was found abandoned, his weapon missing. No sign of struggle or flight or anything that would explain where he had gone. Crawford initially assumed that Tackett had deserted, had fled the county for reasons that the sheriff's corruption made understandable. But when no trace of the deputy emerged over the following days, when his family reported that he had not contacted them, when the absence stretched into a disappearance that could not be explained by any theory the investigators proposed, Crawford began to suspect something else. The second disappearance came 3 days later, claiming Robert Lawson, another deputy who had been present at the Combs property. Lawson vanished under circumstances identical to Tackett's, vehicle abandoned, no witnesses, no evidence, no explanation. The pattern that would define November of 1963 had been established. That's right. The deputies continued to disappear throughout November, 1 or 2 every few days, each vanishing without any indication of what had happened to them. The third and fourth disappearances came during the second week, the fifth and sixth during the third. By Thanksgiving, 8 deputies had vanished, and the remainder had begun to understand that something was hunting them. Crawford ordered his remaining men to travel in pairs, to maintain communication at all times, to report any unusual circumstances immediately. The precautions proved inadequate. The 9th and 10th deputies disappeared together, their vehicles found side by side on a road where they had apparently stopped for reasons that could not be determined. Whatever had taken them had taken both simultaneously, had left no evidence that pursuit could follow. The fear that spread through the sheriff's department was unlike anything Breathitt County had experienced since the feuds of the previous century. Deputies who had participated in the Combs murders began to understand that they were being hunted by something that could reach them regardless of precautions, that could take them from vehicles or homes or anywhere they believed themselves safe. Some resigned, deciding that no salary was worth dying for. Others demanded to be transferred to duties that kept them away from the areas where the disappearances had occurred. Crawford himself became increasingly erratic as November progressed, as the deputies who remained grew fewer, and as the fear that gripped them became impossible to conceal. He had built his position on the appearance of absolute authority, on the belief that his power could not be challenged. Now that belief was crumbling, and with it crumbled the confidence that had characterized his tenure. The 11th through 15th disappearances occurred during the final week of November, taking deputies who had attempted to flee the county, who had surrounded themselves with protection, who had taken every precaution that seemed reasonable. None of the precautions proved adequate. Ezekiel reached them anyway, took them without leaving evidence that investigation could follow, demonstrated capabilities that the modern world had forgotten men could possess. The disappearances paused during the final days of November, during the period when the nation mourned President Kennedy, and when attention that might have been paid to missing deputies in an obscure Kentucky county was directed elsewhere. Ezekiel used the pause to prepare for the campaign's conclusion, to position himself for the final phase that would take Crawford and the remaining deputies who had participated in his family's murders. The 16th and 17th disappearances occurred on December 1st, taking the deputies who had been assigned to protect Crawford himself. They vanished from positions directly outside the safe house where the sheriff was hiding, were taken without alerting Crawford or the remaining deputies who shared his refuge. The message was clear. No protection was adequate, no precaution would succeed. The hunter could reach anyone regardless of what measures they employed. Crawford attempted to flee on December 3rd, arranged transportation that he believed was secret, planned a route that would take him far from Kentucky and the vengeance that had claimed 17 of his men. He did not understand that Ezekiel had been waiting for exactly this attempt, had positioned himself to intercept any escape. The confrontation occurred on a mountain road, where the terrain forced vehicles to slow, where the forest pressed close on both sides, where an ambush could not be avoided. Crawford's remaining guards, deputies 18 through 20, died in the first seconds of the encounter, killed by fire from positions they never identified. Then Crawford was alone, trapped in a vehicle that was going nowhere, facing a man who emerged from the forest with the patience of someone who had been waiting for this moment since the morning he watched his family die. "Do you remember Sarah Combs?" Ezekiel asked, his voice carrying the flatness of someone for whom emotion had been replaced by purpose. "Do you remember the woman you shot while she was working in her garden? Do you remember my son Thomas, who was 17 years old and who you killed while he was running toward his mother's body?" Crawford tried to speak, to offer explanations or bargains that might delay what was clearly coming. He tried to invoke the authority that his badge supposedly provided, the law that his position supposedly represented. None of it mattered to the man who faced him, whose family had been murdered by that law and that authority. "You killed my family because you wanted our land," Ezekiel continued. "You murdered a woman and a boy because the people who own you wanted timber and coal that our property contained. You thought your badge would protect you from consequences. You thought your patrons would ensure that justice never reached you. You were wrong about both." What Ezekiel did to Vernon Crawford during the 3 days before the sheriff died would be detailed in journals that would not be discovered for 40 years. The death was not quick, was not meant to be quick. It was designed to match and exceed the suffering that Crawford had inflicted, to ensure that the sheriff understood fully what he was experiencing and why. Crawford's body was never found. The final deputy, number 21, disappeared on December 6th, his fate joining the others in a mystery that would not be solved for 4 decades. The vanishing, as it came to be called, was complete. Every deputy who had participated in the murders of Sarah and Thomas Combs had disappeared, their bodies never recovered, their fates unknown to everyone except the man who had accomplished their elimination. The investigation that followed was the most intensive in Kentucky history to that point. Involved state and federal authorities who could not accept that 21 law enforcement officers could simply vanish without explanation. The search continued for months, then years, covered terrain that investigators believed no one could have used as effectively as the evidence suggested someone had used it. They found nothing. The mountains kept their secrets, and the man who had created those secrets had vanished as completely as his victims. Ezekiel Combs disappeared into the wilderness that had always been his home, and he did not emerge for 40 years. The mountains of eastern Kentucky became his sanctuary, terrain that he knew better than any map could document, that concealed him through decades of solitude that would have destroyed anyone with less purpose. He found a location that no search could discover, a valley so remote that even the mountain families who lived nearby did not know of its existence. The entrance was concealed by terrain that appeared impassable, a series of rock formations that seemed to offer no route through but that contained passages known only to those who had discovered them. Ezekiel's grandfather had found the valley in 1885, had kept its location secret even from most of his family, had passed the knowledge to Ezekiel's father, who had passed it to Ezekiel during a hunting trip when he was a boy. The valley was approximately a mile long and half a mile wide, enclosed by walls of rock that rose hundreds of feet on all sides. A stream ran through its center, fed by springs that emerged from the rock face and flowed year-round regardless of drought. The floor of the valley was covered with forest that had grown undisturbed since before Europeans arrived, trees whose size suggested centuries of growth uninterrupted by any human activity. He built a cabin against a cliff face that provided one wall and protection from weather that might otherwise have made the location uninhabitable. The construction occupied his first year, gave purpose to days that might otherwise have been consumed by grief that his campaign had delayed but not eliminated. He built with techniques his father had taught him, created a structure that would last through decades of occupation. The cabin was small but adequate, approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, a single room that contained everything he needed and nothing that served no purpose. He built a fireplace from stones gathered from the stream, constructed a chimney that vented smoke effectively through fissures in the rock face. He built furniture from timber that the valley provided, created a bed and a table and chairs that were crude but functional. The construction served purposes beyond mere shelter. The physical labor occupied hands that might otherwise have been idle, provided focus for a mind that grief threatened to overwhelm. Each log that he shaped, each stone that he positioned, each piece of the cabin that took form under his hands represented progress towards something rather than dwelling on everything that had been lost. He built a smokehouse for preserving meat, a small structure positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds that would carry smoke away from the main cabin. He dug a root cellar into the hillside, created storage space where vegetables could survive through winters that would have destroyed them otherwise. He constructed an outhouse at the edge of the clearing, built a woodshed that would keep fuel dry through seasons of precipitation. The complex that eventually surrounded his cabin represented years of continuous improvement, showed what determined labor could accomplish even in the most isolated circumstances. The garden he established occupied a clearing near the cabin, a space where sunlight reached the ground for most of the day. He planted seeds that he had gathered before his disappearance, seeds that his family had cultivated for generations. The first garden produced poorly, the soil less fertile than he had hoped. He learned from the failure, amended the soil with materials gathered from the forest floor, selected varieties that the conditions could support. Subsequent years produced better results as his understanding of the specific requirements deepened. Potatoes became his staple, hardy enough to survive the mountain conditions and nutritious enough to sustain him through winters that lasted 5 months or more. He grew varieties that Sarah had favored, seeds saved from the garden where she had died, connections to a past that he refused to entirely abandon. Beans and squash provided variety, corn provided meal that could be stored indefinitely, herbs provided flavoring that made monotonous food more tolerable. The hunting evolved over years into a system that produced reliable results with minimal effort. He learned the patterns of deer and turkey that populated the ridges around his valley, developed techniques for taking them that required neither firearms whose sound might attract attention, nor traps whose presence might be discovered. He constructed snares and deadfalls that captured game while he attended to other tasks, checked them daily during seasons when they were active. The meat he obtained was processed and preserved through techniques that his father had taught him, and that generations of mountain people had refined. He smoked venison into jerky that would last for months, rendered fat that provided calories through the leanest periods, utilized every portion of every animal, because waste was something his circumstances would not permit. The first years were consumed by grief that the campaign of killing had delayed but not eliminated. Now, with the vengeance complete and nothing remaining to distract him, he mourned a wife and son whose deaths he had witnessed but had been unable to prevent. The grief was a weight that pressed down on him constantly, made breathing difficult, made every movement require effort that seemed disproportionate to any possible benefit. He would lie in his cabin for days at a time, unable to gather the motivation to eat or tend the fire or perform any of the tasks that survival required. The isolation amplified everything, left no distraction from pain that seemed to have no limit. The first winter was the worst, a test of preparations that grief had compromised, and of determination that seemed to have no remaining purpose. The cold penetrated the cabin through gaps he had not adequately sealed, through a fireplace that did not draw as well as it should, through weakness in construction that his distracted mind had not corrected. He came close to dying multiple times during those months, from cold that his fire could not adequately address, from hunger that his inadequate stores could not satisfy, from despair that made survival seem pointless. But spring came eventually, as spring always does, and with it came renewed determination that he could not entirely explain. Perhaps it was Sarah's voice in his mind, telling him that she had not married a man who would simply lie down and die. Perhaps it was Thomas's memory, the boy who had looked up to his father and who would have been ashamed to see him surrender. Perhaps it was simply stubbornness, the same quality that had allowed him to survive the war and to accomplish vengeance that seemed impossible. He spoke to Sarah and Thomas constantly, held conversations with the dead that seemed as real as any he had held when they were alive. He described his days to them, asked their opinions about decisions that survival required, maintained relationships that death had interrupted, but that his mind refused to end. The conversations might have been madness, but they sustained him through years when nothing else could have. He saw their faces in dreams that came every night, relived the moment of their deaths in visions that he could not prevent and could not escape. The 30 seconds during which they had died stretched into eternities that he experienced again and again, moments of helplessness that his vengeance had answered but had not erased. There were times when he considered ending his existence, when the weight of isolation seemed too heavy to carry. He would stand at the edge of cliffs that offered quick release, would hold weapons that could end his suffering in seconds, would imagine reunion with Sarah and Thomas that death might provide. But something always stopped him. Perhaps it was the stubbornness that had allowed him to survive the war and to kill 21 deputies without being caught. Perhaps it was fear that death would not bring the reunion he hoped for, that whatever waited beyond was not the presence of those he had loved. Perhaps it was simply the momentum of existence, the habit of living that continued because stopping required effort that continuing did not. The grief did not pass, but it transformed into something he could carry. Sarah and Thomas remained present in his existence, companions whose voices he heard in his mind and whose presence he felt in moments of quiet that the valley provided. He spoke to them daily, described his activities and asked for guidance that memory provided, maintained relationships that death had interrupted but had not ended. He kept journals throughout his isolation, documented his days and thoughts in notebooks he made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals served multiple purposes. They provided activity that filled hours that might otherwise have been empty. They created records that would eventually explain what had happened and why, and they maintained connections to language and thought that pure solitude might otherwise have eroded. He wrote about Sarah and Thomas constantly, preserved memories through descriptions that exceeded what photographs could have captured. He described Sarah's laugh, Thomas's curiosity, moments they had shared as a family that his written words now preserved against forgetting. The writing kept them alive in ways that memory alone could not accomplish. "I killed 21 men," he wrote in an entry from 1975, 12 years into his isolation. "I killed them because they murdered my wife and son. I killed them because the law protected them and abandoned Sarah and Thomas. I killed them because justice was not available through any other means. I do not regret what I did. I would do it again, would do it 1,000 times if 1,000 times were required." He wrote about the killings in detail that would eventually provide answers to questions that investigators had abandoned. Each disappearance was documented, each method was explained. Each body's location was recorded in code that would require knowledge of the property to decipher. The journals were a confession that Ezekiel intended to survive him, a truth that he believed the world should eventually know. "They called it the Vanishing," he wrote in a later entry. "They searched for years without understanding that the vanishing was not supernatural, was not the work of forces beyond human comprehension. It was the work of one man who had been trained for exactly this kind of operation and who had nothing left to lose. I made them vanish because they made my family vanish." The symmetry seemed appropriate. The decades accumulated with rhythms that the seasons provided. He watched the world change from vantage points that allowed observation without detection. He saw aircraft become more common, vehicles change in appearance, evidence that the world was transforming in ways he could observe but not participate in. He watched the community that had murdered his family continue as though nothing had happened, saw children grow into adults who had no memory of the vanishing that their parents still whispered about. He observed the investigations that continued sporadically for years after the disappearances, watched searchers cover terrain that came close to his valley but never penetrated its concealment. He felt something like satisfaction when they gave up, when the case files were closed, with notations that the perpetrator had likely died in the wilderness. He had accomplished what he had set out to accomplish, had demonstrated that some crimes would have consequences regardless of what badges the perpetrators wore. By the early 2000s, Ezekiel was in his 80s, had survived alone in the wilderness for 4 decades, had maintained his existence through capabilities that most people would have found impossible. The strength that had allowed him to kill 21 deputies had long since faded, replaced by adaptations that his intelligence devised and that his determination implemented. He knew that his time was ending. The body that had served him through war and through 40 years of solitary existence was finally surrendering to age that nothing could delay indefinitely. He prepared for death as he had prepared for everything else, with practicality that did not exclude reflection, with acceptance that did not preclude the determination that had always characterized him. He wrote final entries in his journals, messages for whoever might eventually find his remains. He explained that the journals contained truth that he wanted known, that the mystery of the vanishing deserved resolution, that Sarah and Thomas Combs should be remembered alongside the vengeance that had answered their murders. Ezekiel Combs did not die in his cabin. He emerged from the wilderness on September 15, 2003, exactly 40 years after the month when the vanishing had occurred. He walked into the town of Jackson, Kentucky, approached the sheriff's office that had once been commanded by Vernon Crawford, and surrendered himself to authorities who had no idea who he was or what he was confessing to. The walk from his valley to Jackson took 3 days. 3 days during which he passed through a world that had changed almost beyond recognition since he had last walked among other people. The roads were different, paved where they had once been gravel, carrying vehicles that bore no resemblance to the trucks and cars he remembered. The buildings were different, some new and others simply aged in ways that 4 decades had produced. The people were different, faces he did not recognize replacing faces that had populated his memories for 40 years. He was 83 years old, weathered by 4 decades of wilderness living, barely recognizable as the man whose photograph still hung in cold case files. His hair had turned white and had grown past his shoulders in a style that wilderness living had determined. His beard reached his chest, had not been trimmed since he had entered his valley 40 years before. His body was thin but strong, maintained by labor that had not ceased simply because age had made it more difficult. He carried a satchel containing the journals that documented everything: the murders of his family, the disappearances of 21 deputies, the locations where their bodies could be found, the 40 years of isolation that had followed. The satchel also contained photographs of Sarah and Thomas, images that he had carried with him into the wilderness and that had sustained him through decades of solitude. The deputies who received him at the sheriff's office did not know how to respond to the man who stood before them. He looked like a homeless person, like someone who had wandered out of the hills in search of assistance that social services should provide. His claims seemed impossible, the ramblings of a confused elderly man whose mind had perhaps deteriorated beyond the point where his words could be trusted. "My name is Ezekiel Combs," he told the deputies who received him, his voice carrying clarity that his appearance seemed to contradict. "In 1963, Vernon Crawford and his men murdered my wife and son. I killed Crawford and everyone who participated. I've been living in the mountains ever since. I'm ready to face whatever judgment you determine is appropriate. But first, I want the truth to be known. My family deserves that." The deputies exchanged glances that communicated skepticism that none of them voiced. They had heard of the vanishing, of course. Everyone in Breathitt County had heard of the vanishing, but the idea that the man responsible was standing before them, had survived alone in the wilderness for 40 years, was confessing to crimes that had been committed when their parents were children, the idea seemed too fantastic to accept. One of the deputies, a young man whose grandfather had been a child when the vanishing occurred, decided to take the old man seriously, if only to document claims that could later be verified or dismissed. He led Ezekiel to an interview room, provided water and food that the old man accepted, with a gratitude that suggested he had not eaten well in some time, and began asking questions that would eventually produce the most detailed confession in Kentucky criminal history. The confession that followed over subsequent days was exhaustive. Ezekiel described every killing, every method, every location where remains could be recovered. He explained how he had exploited terrain that the deputies did not understand, how he had used skills that the war had taught him, how he had made 21 men vanish without leaving any evidence that investigation could follow. He described the murders of Sarah and Thomas with detail that required multiple pauses, with emotion that 4 decades of isolation had not diminished. He wept while recounting the moment when he had crested the ridge and seen his son falling. Wept while describing the 30 seconds during which everything he had built had been destroyed. The deputies who witnessed this confession understood that they were seeing genuine grief, that the claims the old man was making were not the fantasies of a disturbed mind. Search teams were dispatched to locations that Ezekiel's journals indicated, teams that expected to find nothing and that instead found exactly what the old man had promised. The bodies were discovered in states of preservation that varied depending on the conditions of their burial, some barely recognizable after 40 years and others surprisingly intact. The forensic evidence confirmed Ezekiel's accounts, showed methods that matched his descriptions, proved that the confession they had received was genuine in every particular. The revelation produced headlines across the country. The vanishing of 1963 had never been forgotten in Kentucky, had remained one of the great mysteries of the state's history. The solution, a single veteran whose family had been murdered and who had spent 40 years hiding in plain sight, exceeded anything investigators had imagined during the decades they had spent searching. Investigators who examined the historical records discovered evidence that supported Ezekiel's account of what had been done to his family. Documents were found that confirmed Crawford's corruption, that confirmed the scheme that had targeted the Combs property, that showed the murders of Sarah and Thomas had been planned rather than reactive. The corruption that had killed his family was exposed alongside the vengeance it had provoked. Ezekiel was not prosecuted. The statute of limitations had long since expired. The witnesses who might have testified were dead, and the defendant was 83 years old, with a life expectancy measured in months rather than years. The prosecutor who reviewed the case concluded that prosecution would serve no purpose except to punish a man who had already punished himself with 40 years of isolation. He died on December 6, 2003, exactly 40 years to the day after the final deputy had disappeared. He died in a hospital bed, surrounded by relatives he had not seen in 4 decades, reconciled with a world he had abandoned when that world had destroyed everything he loved. He was buried beside Sarah and Thomas, in graves that had waited 40 years for him to join them. The inscription on his stone reads, Ezekiel Combs, 1920-2003. They murdered his family. He answered. He waited 40 years. Together again at last. The songs that emerged from the Kentucky Vanishing story were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of what was done to Ezekiel's family and the patience of a man who spent 40 years waiting for the chance to explain what he had done. The first verse described the Combs family before the vanishing, the farm that had been in the family for generations, the wife and son whose lives would be stolen by men with badges. The melody was warm and secure, suggesting stability that should have been protected. The second verse described the murders, the deputies who opened fire on a woman in her garden and a boy running to help her, the 30 seconds that destroyed everything Ezekiel had built. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described the transformation, the veteran who became something else when he watched his family die, the skills that war had provided finding purpose that peace had not required. The melody grew cold and purposeful, suggesting calculation that had replaced feeling. The fourth verse described the vanishing itself, the 21 deputies who disappeared over 6 weeks, the investigations that found nothing because there was nothing to find. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting fate that could not be escaped. The fifth verse described the 40 years of hiding, the man who became a ghost in mountains that had always been his home, the wife and son who remained alive in conversation that he maintained daily. The melody softened, became almost peaceful, suggesting existence that had found meaning in memory. The final verse described the emergence and the confession, the 83-year-old man who walked out of the wilderness to tell the truth that he wanted the world to know. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience, however painful, eventually receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Ezekiel rests beside the family he avenged, to read the inscription that promises they are together again at last? Would you walk through the valley where he survived for 40 years? Would you try to understand how love and grief could sustain a life that had lost everything except the memory of what it had possessed? The journey to Breathitt County is easier now than it was in 1963. The roads paved, and the world more connected than it was when deputies murdered a woman in her garden and a boy running toward his mother. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of families rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo, still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Kentucky Vanishing of 1963. The man who killed 21 deputies and vanished for 40 years into the mountains. A story of love that became fury, that became decades of solitude that ended only when the truth could finally be told. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Ezekiel Combs made 21 deputies vanish after they murdered his wife and son, then disappeared into a hidden valley for 40 years before emerging to confess everything and to ensure that the truth was finally known. What about you? If deputies murdered your wife while she worked in her garden and shot your son while he ran toward her body, could you make them all vanish and then disappear yourself for 40 years? Could you wait that long for the chance to tell the truth, to ensure that your family's story was not forgotten? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some men love their families so completely that 40 years of isolation is merely the price of ensuring that the truth survives. Thanks for listening to this story, and as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the veterans who call them home.